everyone, so this is your pre-record of your Thursday lesson, and then there'll be another one to follow for Friday, which I'll set as a separate assignment. So make sure you've got your notes and your file to hand. Pause and run and get it if you need to, because as I progress through the video, after little explanations, I'll be telling you to pause and to complete tasks. So your first task is just to get yourself ready, and this would be your title for today. So we're moving on slightly, still in the attachment topic, of course, but we're going to start to look at the theories of attachment. And what we mean when we talk about a theory is an explanation or a proposed explanation, in particular about why attachments form. So up till now, so far in the topic, just to zoom out and give you that bigger picture, we've identified what we mean by an attachment, which is that reciprocal emotional bond between the two people where they get a sense of emotional security. We've looked at the early signs of attachments forming, and we've seen it in infants as young as 12 days old when we looked at the Meltzoff and Moore research and that interactional synchronicity, reciprocity that we see. We've looked a little bit further on into childhood in terms of identifying the different stages of attachment with the Schafer and Emerson study. So the asocial becomes the indiscriminate, which becomes the specific, which leads to the multiple attachments. And that's kind of where we're up to. So far, what we've been doing really is describing. We've described attachment in its various forms. What we now need to start moving on to is explaining, so looking at that why question, why do they form? So the infant and its primary caregiver, we've seen that there are signs of attachment, but why does that happen? So that's the focus of today's lesson. But we will start, as we always do, with our retrieval, and you'll see why I've chosen this particular retrieval, because it is going to feed into this new piece of learning and it's going to give you something to hook it onto. So going back to the language of learning theory in our approaches topic, the behavioural approach, and in particular classical conditioning. So on your piece of paper underneath your title, subtitle retrieval. I've said whiteboard challenge there, but the same idea applies. What do each of those letters stand for? We should be good with that. And in Pavlov's dogs, what was the UCS? Okay, so just really one word answers in that column. The end column is blanked out for now, so I don't expect you to do it as part of your retrieval, but by the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to apply that same language to the idea of why an attachment might form. So that's to come back to, but you can do those first two columns. So pause this and have a go, and then when you're ready, unpause and we'll review the answers. So no cheating by looking ahead. So let's review those answers. So UCS is obviously the unconditioned stimulus, and in Pavlov's dogs that was the food that the dogs were presented with, and automatically, instinctively, involuntary, remember, they weren't choosing to salivate, that they would automatically salivate. So our unconditioned response was the salivation from the dogs. The neutral stimulus, the thing that Pavlov did every time the dogs were presented with the food, was ringing of the bell. So the bell, and we remember that our neutral always becomes our conditioned, so that never changes. But what's changed is that by the time we get to our conditioned stimulus, the learning has taken place, the conditioning has happened. And we know that takes time and consistency, but by this point, our conditioned response is that the dog, when it just hears the bell alone with no food present, you can't smell or see the food, they will still produce that salivation. And we know that was our fundamental turning point where we started to understand that animals, but subsequently humans, learn through association. The connection, the association had been made. So as I say, as we progress through this lesson, we're going to be able to apply that same principle to why an attachment might form between the mother and the infant. And so we'll be able to substitute some of these words here for the mother-infant connection. Okay, so I know we would normally only do one retrieval, but because it's going to be really important that we've got this knowledge, prior knowledge at our disposal, I'm going to ask you again to pause this video and write down some very brief but succinct and accurate definitions for those 4 terms or words on the board there on the screen. Okay, so what do we mean by classical conditioning? What do we mean by operant? What is tabula rasa and what does that link to? And what does the word innate mean? Innate might be the tricky one there, but I want you to have a go nonetheless because it's going to be important for us. Okay, so again, pause and unpause when you're ready. So hopefully you had that classical conditioning is learning through association, whereas operant conditioning, remember, still both belonging to the behavioural approach, is learning through that reinforcement. And we know that can either be positive reinforcement, where we do something again because we want to be rewarded, or negative reinforcement, where we do something again because it avoids a negative consequence. It stops something unpleasant. That's going to be helpful and relevant for us when we're looking at why attachments might form with very young infants. Tabula rasa was that term for blank canvas. So again, we associate it with the behavioural approach because it says we are born a blank canvas. We have nothing. Everything that we become is because we have somehow learned it. And that word innate, built in. If something is innate, it is built into who you are as a human and it exists from birth. So that's going to be an interesting contrasting idea to this blank canvas, and that's where we're really going to focus this first part of the theories topic. Is it that we have the ability to form an attachment innately from the moment we're born? Is there something inside of us that means we will form attachments? That's one argument. And the other argument from the learning theory side of things is that we're born a blank canvas, and if we want to form attachments, we've got to learn somehow through classical or operant conditioning, we've got to learn to form those attachments. Okay, so we can organize that into, I can illustrate that using a diagram such as this. And this is what we're going to be looking at over coming lessons, okay? Today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the right-hand side of that diagram, the learning theories of attachment. But we can divide it into these 2 big areas. We've got the learning theories of attachment that we're going to start with today, which say that we are born a blank canvas. We have to, a tabula rasa, we have to learn everything. So we don't have any innate tendency, inbuilt tendency to form an attachment. We actually learn to form attachments. This theory says because of food. All comes back to food. So those wonderful high quality emotional attachments that you have with your parents today, this theory would tell us they began just because you wanted food and you were hungry. So it kind of it brings it back down to the bare necessities of life, if you like. Evolutionary theory, on the other hand, and we haven't really had much of an opportunity yet in the approaches topic previous to explore evolutionary theory. We located it within the biological, but we didn't unpack the ideas. So we're going to be unpacking the evolutionary ideas. But you'll be familiar with evolution from your GCSE biology and just from your general understanding about the world. We know that evolutionary theory suggests that we have, as human beings, evolved to be the way we have and to have characteristics which are innate, they are inbuilt into what it is to be human, that give us some sort of advantage, some sort of survival advantage. So this theory of attachment, the evolutionary side of this, tells us that attachment and the tendency to form attachments with our primary caregivers is innate. We're born with it. It's built into us. And it's present in both mothers and babies. Because if we think about the idea of evolutionary, trying to ensure the passing on of your genetics, it's advantageous, it's a benefit for the mother to form an attachment with the infant so that the infant survives. And it's obviously advantageous for the infant to form an attachment with the mother, so it's got somebody feeding it and looking after it and protecting it so that it survives. So evolutionary brings it all back down to survival. And we'll be exploring both of those. Today, as I say, we're focusing over here, learning theories of attachment. So all of that language that you've just retrieved, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, tabula rasa, is going to be really helpful and important to us, which is why we did it. Okay, so here we are. This is the language I'm referring to. But here we're starting to link it to this idea of attachment. So when we're talking about classical conditioning, our primary caregiver, our mum, let's say mum, but we know we use the proper language, our primary caregiver, is the neutral stimulus. But it becomes associated with food over time, because every time the infant is fed, mum's there. Now that doesn't, we're not assuming that mum's breastfeeding, although many obviously do, but even bottle feeding, the midwives will encourage it to be the mother that is always feeding the baby, and she should always be there when the baby is being fed. For this reason, because this theory tells us that the baby from those very early feedings will be making a link, an association between mum, primary caregiver, and food. Okay, so in a minute we'll look at that end column in that table. We know that babies are they've just come into this world, and it will have been a massive shock. The noise, the feelings, the experiences, they're suddenly aware of themselves and their bodies to a certain extent, and they'll be experiencing things they don't like. One of the things they'll be experiencing is hunger. And so when mum feeds baby, it stops an unpleasant feeling of hunger. They won't understand they're hungry. They'll just know it doesn't feel nice, and they'll be crying as a way of getting some food or getting some attention, certainly. And that is reinforcing not just the crying behaviour, but also reinforcing this idea that, oh, mum stops that unpleasant feeling. So our operant conditioning is going to be helpful here as well. And we're going to talk about primary and secondary drives. So the primary drive is hunger, but the secondary drive is this idea of the satisfaction that's provided by the caregiver, because the caregiver is always there when I'm being fed as an infant. So we're going to be exploring and unpacking that a bit further. Certainly these would be important terms. That's just actually taken out of the textbook, so you've got that reference as well. So on Teams, in the assignment section alongside where you found this video, I've told you it's page 80 of the textbook, and I've even given you another reminder of what the link is for that. So there's some reading to be done there, please. That's one of the tasks, to read through this learning theory of attachment. Again, turn it into some flashcards. What are the key terms that we need to be familiar with so that you're ready to do some self-testing? So that's one task. I'm not going to ask you to send me photographs of those flashcards. That's your responsibility. You keep on top of that. You keep testing yourself on it. It will pay off if you do that. Okay, so I've turned off the camera, so I'm not in the way of what you need to see. But let's have a look at that table again then that you began the lesson with. We've got our unconditioned stimulus, which is food. And when we provide the baby with food, usually because they were previously crying and we've sensed, okay, they're due a feed, what automatically, involuntary, again, just like Pavlov's dogs, is the response to that is they feel a sense of comfort and satisfaction. You've managed to stop that unpleasant feeling of hunger that they were experiencing. So that's the unconditioned response. At the same time as that food being provided, who did we have? Well, we had mum, or the primary caregiver. We know it's not always mum, but often this research generalizes and suggests that it is. We had the primary caregiver being there. And baby very quickly learns that every time mum's there, I'm getting this nice feeling of satisfaction because I'm being fed. And so our mum becomes our conditioned stimulus. And our conditioned response over time, and it takes time, is that baby will stop crying or feel that same sense of comfort and satisfaction at the sight of the mother, even when she's not feeding it. Of course, if it's still desperately hungry, it's going to cry. But we're starting to see the early stages of an attachment where the baby is getting satisfaction and comfort, emotional security just from mum. No longer just about the food. It started off being about the food, but it's no longer just about the food. In the same way that the dogs just salivated at the food at first, but became conditioned to salivate at the bell. So when we see it side by side with Pavlov's dogs there, here we've got another real life application of Pavlov's dog's classical conditioning, haven't we? We've now got an application of it where we can try and understand why an attachment might form between an infant and their primary caregiver in the very early days. It's all about food. Everything's about food. So the other task that I'd like you to do, and again, you would need to pause and you'd need to access in Teams assignment the Word document that I've shared, and it's called Learning Theory Exam Questions. There's just 2 questions on there, and I'd like you to have a go at those in your exercise book, and I'd like you to submit the photos on Teams. Okay, and I will give you the feedback on that, but I need you to make sure you're submitting the photographs of your work. Otherwise, it's really going to be a challenge for me to provide the feedback that you need. So we've got a bit of an application question, and then we've got an evaluation question. So you're not going to be able to tackle that until you've done the reading from the textbook and until you've engaged with this lesson. So that's your task to do. Okay, we're going to be moving on next lesson on Friday, which again will be pre-recorded, to think about evaluating a little bit further. And in order to evaluate further, we bring in somebody called Harlow. There is a video clip, again shared on Teams, that I'd like you to watch about Harlow's monkeys. And what we will then do is we will build up to drawing some evaluative conclusions from that in Friday's lesson. So before Friday, you should have done watch the video clip on Harlow's monkeys, completed the exam question on the learning theories, read and created flashcards from page 80-81 in the textbook, and then you'll be ready to move on. And please do submit the photographs of those exam questions to me, or if you type into the Word document, you can attach that and submit the entire document to me through Teams. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I'll be available on Teams in the chat forum for your group when your scheduled lesson takes place, and also on email. So if as you're tackling these tasks you need any further support, you've got any questions or problems, please just give me a shout. Okay, I'll be there live. All right, take care. Thanks very much, and check in again tomorrow.